what makes watercolor look like watercolor? If you look at the outer edge right along here, you'll notice that there's a line that wraps around the base color. This is created when you have dry paper and then you put wet watercolor on it and then it puddles on the inside. So that area is going to give you a nice clean color, okay? And then what's going to happen on the outer edge, it dries to these dark lines. So that's the fringe, okay? So that's the fringe. So when you look at my brushes, when I'm painting with them, I always like to control this fringe. Okay, so for example, let me show you a brush and how this would work. Create a new layer, make sure it's set to multiply. And we'll jump here, let's go all the way down. And we're gonna pick something like this granular fringe, okay? So let's give it a color. Make sure, again, your watercolor, to make the watercolor feel and look like watercolor, you want to make sure the layer is turned on and multiply. So now when I brush down, you can see how it gives me that darker edge. Now, as long as I keep painting, it's going to keep giving me that watercolor edge as I push out. The way I have the brush set up, pressure sensitivity also impacts it. So if I do lighter pressure, you don't get as hard of a fringe edge, and if I press harder, you get a harder edge. Okay, now this is what helps create that look. Okay, now here's the difference though. In real life, if you're doing real watercolor, if I were to brush back into this, this inside would be wet, so we wouldn't get an edge like this. Okay, now there are some applications like Corel Painter, Eclipse Studio has this too, where when you can go on the inside here, this will read as wet and you won't get this line, but in Photoshop we do, so we need to get rid of that. Okay, so what I do is I create a keyboard shortcut for the smudge tool, and I made brushes that are watercolor, designed for watercolor and smudging. So I have a keyboard shortcut which is the letter V, like in victory, and it's right next to the letter B, like in boy, which is my brush. Okay, so if I come in here, I say, so let's say I want a soft blender like this. Okay, now you can see it's turned on the blender smudge tool, and then I can come in here and lose the edge on the inside to simulate this. Now, obviously it'd be great if we didn't have to do this, but it is what it is. This is Photoshop. If you use Adobe Fresco, you don't have to do this at all, because Adobe Fresco is watercolor. I'm going to say close to perfect as I've experienced so far digitally. Okay, now with this set, if I hit the letter B, I can go back to my brush. Okay, and you can see this. See, now I have that fringe like that. And then if I want to lose the edge or soft pressure, okay, and then if I hit I'm a hold letter V, and it's holding and switching to the smudge tool, and then I can soften that out of there. Okay, now one other technique that you want to be aware of before we start painting here is that when we want to get colors that kind of bleed into each other, like this right here, that's more of a wet into, well, it's actually not wet into wet, but this area inside is wet into wet. When you would normally do wet into wet, you fill up your whole page with water, and then you apply your brush that's loaded with watercolor or color pigment, and it kind of bleeds and spreads out. Well, in order to pull that off, we need to have brushes that don't have a fringe. Okay, and so any brush in here that's like diffused wash, diffused, soft wash, anything like this, it means the color is going to bleed out like it's bleeding into paper. Here's some other kind of washes, and you can see how they all look slightly different. You can paint into each other, and then again, if I hold letter V, I can soften up some of the edges. And with real watercolor, you would have another brush with clear water, and you would brush into the edge to soften up. Okay, so one of the main things to remember when you're working with watercolor is that you want to make sure you maintain your layers and make sure you have those layers set to multiply. So when you think about real watercolor, you would put a wash down, and then when you apply that wash, you would either let it dry naturally or you would use a hair dryer to speed up the process of it drying. If you're using watercolor paper, what's going to happen is going to set, and then you can layer additional layers on top of that. So with Photoshop, if you want to deepen a value and make it darker, you're going to have to create a new layer so that it will not disturb the color on the layer that's there. This is really key. So there are some watercolor brushes that you might pick up that are designed where they just continually get darker on one layer, and for me, I don't like those brushes at all. So I created my own brushes because I can't stand that. You can't control the values correctly. It goes deep into the way the brushes used to be set up, especially in Corel Paint, or they used to call it build-up brushes, where the color just will always be transparent and always build and build and build until you eventually get to black. But that's not how real watercolor works. So I don't do it that way. I set up my brushes completely different. Now, one thing to remember is that in this initial stage also is that you always start with your lightest colors, just like traditional watercolor, and we build it up slowly. We just want to make sure we tint the color. We leave the surface area underneath white. Digitally, we can go back and erase. We can do things that we would not be able to do with real watercolor, but I still try to adhere to the rules because it'll allow me to go back to real watercolor and still have the habits, the good working habits. So just remember, just keep it light and you build up slowly. As you can see, once I get to this point, this is an additional layer that's being added, and I just keep building it up slowly but surely. I do pay attention to the value, and I pay attention to the temperature of the color as well. You'll always see me going back and forth, or sometimes I'll warm it up, sometimes I'll go back and cool it down. And you just want to remember to pay attention to how the colors will appear when you overlap them, what the color will look like. So at this point, we're darkening the values. So when we darken, you're thinking about two things here. Okay, so we want to increase contrast to create more volume. Okay, the darker we go, the more contrast. Obviously, if the light side of the image is light, this will help round out the form. But there's also another way to think about this. Okay, so when you're drawing and painting, painting, you want to think about, yes, I'm darkening the value, but you also, on one other level, is you can think about the temperature of that value that you're going to use to darken your image. Okay, so if you look around the eyes here and you're looking at shadow areas, I'm using darker colors that are on a cooler side. In particular, they have a little bit more red in them, so they can transition in terms of their temperature towards the yellow, right? Or yellow ochreish sort of tone. And so by having that little bit of red, but keep in mind, it's still really cold in terms of the color. It's close to being a compliment, but that was not my intent when I was working on it, but it just was one of those serendipitous things, right? Very lucky, happy accident. But by putting these cool colors down, as I'm darkening, it's creating additional depth. Okay. Now, the general rule, the basic idea is that warm colors come forward and cool colors recede. Now, that is true, sort of. Not in this illustration. Well, in this illustration, it will ring true to that, but there are times when that rule absolutely does not work. And I usually show this with my students where I'll create a whole painting that's predominantly, well, actually you can do a whole painting predominantly warm, and then if you drop in a cool color with the idea of thinking that it's going to recede, it will not. Because if you have a, let's say 90% of a painting is red and red-orange, and you put any sort of blue or green in there, because it's a contrast color, it's going to pop out of the frame. And so this is one of those things where you're learning these things in class, you know, and art school, I hear these things, and sometimes it drives me nuts because I was taught these things, and when I was painting, I followed these rules that just didn't work in reality sometimes, and my paintings were falling apart. And it's one of those things where if you paint long enough and you trust your gut and your instincts, you'll start learning things that are not in textbooks and things that you're not going to pick up from other people. You know, and you just play around with it. And the one thing also about watercolor is that as we're deepening the value here, I said I'm shifting temperature. You can see I'm putting different variations of color all over the place, because with watercolor, the more variations of color, the more interesting it will appear. Unfortunately, my computer crashed while I was finishing this up. But basically, this last step is I'm taking scanned watercolor washes that I've created or collected and just spatter brushes, and I just place them inside of the image to give it that final sort of watercolor effect. And that's really the key. Just giving that little extra something, making sure the values are dark enough, and yeah. If you're interested in using the brushes that I use for this demo, I'll have them 50% for a week, so go grab them. The link will be in the description below.